And for this first photo, we're going to do a sky swap, but before we actually swap the sky out, we're going to develop the basic tone and creative style for this photo. And in doing that, we're going to mask in some different filters and local adjustments. While we're masking, we're going to use some of those topics that I just mentioned, and we're going to use luminosity masking, color range, and then we'll copy and paste some masks. So let's get started here. And for this particular photo, the only thing I've done to it is I've cropped it and I've straightened it out a little bit. It was just a little crooked. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, oops, let's switch my camera profile. Okay, so now I have nothing applied to the shot. The only thing that's on there is a lens correction. So the only thing I'm going to do inside my Develop tab is I'm just going to head into this camera profile area, and because it was a RAW photo, I'm just going to set the tonality for it by heading down to ON1 Landscape. So you'll see there, just a quick little adjustment, kind of pulled up some of these mid-tone areas here, and then added some contrast. So now let's head into Effects, and this is where we're going to start with our creative masking techniques. So for this particular photo, the first thing I want to do is add in some detail. Well, I only want detail applied to certain areas on this photo because it was shot with a longer exposure. Whenever I'm shooting photos with a long exposure, I rarely want any detail on this water area. I want it to be as smooth as possible. Well, with that being said, I do see this area in here could use a lot of detail and a little bit more texture. So we're going to first add a filter, and we're going to add dynamic contrast. And just for the sake of the webinar, I'm going to pull up on this small slider here just to bring in a little bit more so you guys can see it on screen. So now if I zoom in to this area on my water, and I turn this dynamic contrast filter off and on, it's bringing in texture and clarity onto that water, and I really don't want any crunched up detail there. I really only want it applied to this rock area and then these trees and my mountain here. So the first area we need to deal with is these rocks. So I'm going to go into my dynamic contrast filter, and inside my masking options here, I'm going to click it to open it. So now I have all of my masking options here within that filter. Well, because I only want this filter applied to these rocks and these trees in this mountain, I could probably get away with using a color range mask and just tone it down so it's only being applied to this color on the rocks and the color in the trees. So to create a color range mask, head into your masking options for that filter and go down and enable your color range. So now that you've enabled your color range, you got to pick your color. So to pick the color, I'm just going to click on this color dropper here, and I'm just going to drop it on this rock. Well, now what we need to do is we need to head into that filter and we need to view our mask here. So now to modify the mask, we need to head down to that color range, and right below it with this color range slider, you can modify it by pulling it down or up. Well, in this case, we're going to pull it down so that it's only being applied to these rocks and the trees. So now if I view the actual photo and I turn this off and on, it's only being applied to these rocks and these trees here. And if I zoom in, it's not applying any texture on that area that I don't want it applied to. So that's one quick way to specifically apply detail to an area that has a large tonality such as these rocks and these trees. But now we want to apply some detail to our mountain here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a filter. I'm just going to add dynamic contrast. And this isn't really a creative masking technique because we're just going to use our masking brush. But we're going to head into our dynamic contrast filter, and I'm just going to invert this. And now with my masking brush selected, I'm going to head up to the top bar and I'm going to pull up the feathering to 100. And the reason I'm always masking in with my brush at 100 for the feathering is because I like a soft edged brush. I feel like it makes a lot more natural look on your photo, and so I tend to keep my feathering at 100. So with my feathering at 100 and my opacity at 100, I'm going to make sure I'm set to paint in, and I'm just going to brush this kind of loosely on my mountain area here. Boom. So now let's head down to that dynamic contrast filter, and I'm going to pull up on that small a little bit to bring in a little bit more small detail. So now if I turn this off and on, we've quickly just masked this onto our mountain. So now that we have these two dynamic contrast filters applied, I'm just going to double click them to rename them to stay organized. So I'll rename this one Mountain, and then I'll rename this bottom one Rocks. So now what I want to do is I want to deal with a little bit of the color in the photo. Well, an easy way to deal with color inside of effects is to add a split tone filter. So I'm just going to add a filter, and I'm going to add split tone. And one of my favorite preset styles here is this warm style, but I don't want it applied with this mode normal because it's kind of sending in this little like vintage haze look. So if I turn this off and on, it's kind of got that moody look onto it. Well, if we go down into the split tone filter, we can go into our mode, and if we choose color, then it's only going to be applied to the color and we won't have that hazy look. So now if I turn this off and on, I really like what that's doing to the water right here and my sky, but I don't want it applied to the trees or these rocks because it cools down the rocks quite a bit and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do to apply this mask specifically to the areas that are on the water and in the sky is I'm going to use a luminosity mask. So inside my split tone filter, I'm going to go into my masking options, and in my masking options, I have this option called Lumen. So I'm going to click that to apply, and that's going to create a luminosity mask for me. So if I view that luminosity mask, it's creating a mask for me based off the bright and dark areas in my photo. Well, since I only want it applied to these brighter areas, we're good to go, except for the fact that we need to refine the mask a little bit. So to refine your luminosity mask, head into your masking options, and down here below this feather is your level slider. So with this level slider, the best way to explain it is this left side is your blacks, this middle area is your midtones, and this is your highlights. So now if I pull back on this midtone area, it's going to remove the midtones from the mask. Well, I can actually bring highlights back and clean that up even more by simply just pulling back on my highlights. See, by pulling back on my highlights, it's removing the highlighted areas from my sky and in this water here and bringing a lot more light into it and giving it more of that split tone look. So we can just keep kind of modifying this. There we go, just like that. So now if I view this mask and I turn this off and on, that split tone filter is only being applied to this area on the water and in the sky here. Well, if I look at this area on my water here, if I zoom in, it's really faint, but there's kind of a harsh line right here where the mask is, right there. So what I can do to fix that is I can actually go into my masking options, and down here I have this feathering tool. Well, I can just pull up on this and it will feather the mask so it's not so harsh. So now if I zoom out and I view this, now by turning this off and on, you'll notice in this area there's a lot less harsh of a line and it blends a lot more naturally. Okay, so now we've set a few different filters using some creative masking techniques. I'm just going to add one more filter before we start our sky swap, and I'm going to add one of my favorite filters ever, and that's curves. And the reason I'm adding curves is just so I can give this photo a little bit of a mid-tone boost. So I'm just going to head into my curves, and I'm just going to pull up on this mid-tone area just to give it a little bit of a mid-tone boost. Boom. Nothing crazy, just a little bit of a boost for the colors and the midtones. Okay, so now that we have our photo set and we have the tonality set for the shot, now we can start our sky swap. And up here, we're gonna need sort of a small, long exposure sky to match our long exposure on the water. So I'm gonna go into my layers pane here, and I'm gonna add a layer, and I'll go into my extras, ON1 extras, backgrounds, and we'll go into our skies. And I'll just head down to the sky layer I'm looking for, which is this 49 right there. Okay, so now that I've added that sky layer, I'm gonna hit V on my keyboard, and that's gonna grab my move tool. So now I'm gonna pull up on this layer, and I'll just drop it up top here. And then I'm gonna head over to my layers pane, and I'm gonna pull back on the opacity so that I can center it on the sky. I'm actually gonna fix this rotation. I don't know why it's at 2. Maybe it needed to be fixed. Sorry, let me just rotate this a little bit. Okay, that seems to be okay. Okay, but as I pull back on the opacity for this layer, I'm noticing that all of that bright area is on this right side, whereas the bright area in the photo is coming from this left side over here. So we're gonna have to go up to this top toolbar, and we're gonna have to flip it horizontally, so that I have this side where the sun's beaming onto the mountain, and this side where there's not a lot of brightness. So I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger, and then I'm just gonna pull up on it and set it right there. So now I'll head back over to my layers pane here. I'll pull up on the opacity to 100, and then I'll drop that layer below my base layer. So now that I've dropped that layer below my base layer, I'm gonna make sure that I have my base layer selected. Oftentimes when you're dropping layers below other layers, you forget to click it and then you're masking and you don't see anything happening. So common mistake, just make sure that you do reselect that base layer. And now we're gonna brush out our sky area here. And we're gonna do that using our perfect brush. So we're gonna grab our masking brush by hitting B on our keyboard. And now I'm gonna head up to my top tool modifier bar here, and I'm gonna turn on this perfect brush. Now that I have my perfect brush selected, I'm gonna make sure that I have paint out selected. Oops. And now I'm gonna make my brush size a little bit bigger than it is. About right there. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna brush out this sky area. Oops, I'm brushing out the curves. Okay, so I'm gonna click on my masking. So now I'm brushing out this base layer. And I'm just gonna brush out, keeping this minus sign where I don't want it to be brushing out from. There we go. Oops. So I'll just brush this little area back in. And then just kind of go around, and I'm just brushing out little areas that I don't want to be on the shot here. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So now we need to go in and just clean this up a little bit. So I'm just gonna grab my masking brush again, and I'm gonna head up and I'm gonna turn off my perfect brush. And now I'm gonna set it to paint in, and I'm just gonna make sure I paint in these areas that I brushed out. Okay, and now we're gonna refine this mask a little bit. So I'm gonna grab my I'm gonna grab my masking brush real quick and just brush out these little lines in the sky, like that. And then I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna remove this little jaggedy edge with my chisel tool. So I'm gonna go into my refine tools here, and up in this top bar, I'm gonna grab my chisel tool, and I'm gonna make it set to remove because I want it to remove this harsh line around these hills here. So now I'm just gonna brush this on and remove that line. And I can even do it maybe a little bit more. Boom. And I'm actually going to go into this area and I'm going to brush this on. There we go, to bring back that mountain a little bit. And then I'll brush a little bit off. Sorry, just kind of tweaking it a little bit is how to get the best look. Okay, that looks pretty good like that. Then we'll just brush this area on a little bit more over here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do to blend it even more is I'm going to go up and I'm going to have my masking brush selected. And this is the key, is to go up to your opacity and lower it. Lower it down to about 30 or 40. Don't have your perfect brush selected. Get a huge brush size and make sure your brush is set to paint in. And now just kind of brush over this area and blend it in a little bit more. Like that. And so now we need to match this tonality for our mountain here with our sky layer. So we're going to go down to our sky layer and we're going to select it. And then we're going to go into our develop tab for that sky. And we're just going to pull up on the exposure to match our sky. Probably about right there. So now that we have our kind of sky layer replaced up here and it matches the mood of the sky and the exposure, we need to put that on the water to create the reflection. So we're going to go over to our layers pane here and we're going to right click this sky layer. We're going to duplicate that layer. And then we're going to drag this up above our base layer. And I'll just double click it and I'll rename it reflection. So now that we have a reflection layer above our base layer, I'm going to head down to my tone and color and remove the exposure so it's not bright. And now I need to flip it so I can make it look like it's reflected. So just hit V on my keyboard and now I have my move tool selected and I can just head up to my top bar here and I'll just flip it vertically. And now I can drag this down. And I'll lower the opacity so I can set it on this water here. And I'll just kind of match up these lines in the first sky with our second duplicate sky to make it look more natural. And then I'll rotate it just a hair. Perfect. Okay, so now to blend this in, we're going to head over to our layers. I'm going to turn it up all the way. And I'm just going to head down to this gear option here. And I'm going to roll down and I'm going to select darken. So you'll see that by clicking that darken blending mode, it's overlaid it onto our water here and it's blended it quite a bit. But we need to make it a little bit more clean because it's still pretty unnatural on these areas on the reflection. So we can always go into our layers pane and I'm going to lower the opacity quite a bit, probably about right there. And then I'm just going to use my masking brush to clean it up. So I'm going to hit B on my keyboard to grab my masking brush. And then I'm going to head up and make sure I'm set to paint out. And you definitely want a lower opacity for this so you can just create a lot of brush strokes and kind of brush it out from the water. So I'm just going to lower my brush size with my bracket keys on my keyboard. And then I'll just brush this off the areas where I definitely don't want it to be, which is over here. I don't want any on this kind of horizon line water area. And then same thing, we'll just kind of brush this off right here. There we go. Slowly but surely. And then we'll just do one more big one with a lower opacity just to kind of even everything out. And I'm going to go into this reflection by the mountain here and I'm going to remove a lot of this glow because it's not there in the actual sky. So there we go. Okay, cool. So now if I turn this reflection off and on, it's subtle, but it does add a nice little bit of reflection on the water. And the cool thing about these layers is you can always go into your develop pane for each individual layer, and you can pull back on the opacity to make it a little bit darker. And we could probably blend this a little bit more in this area. Right there. Cool. Okay, so now we have our sky layer replaced, and the next thing we need to do is just stylize this as a whole. So I'm actually going to head up to my reflection layer, and I'm going to right click it, and I'm just going to create a new stamped layer. And creating a new stamped layer basically duplicates these 3 layers that you're working on and then merges them together so you have an entire composite to work with while still maintaining those 3 layers that you can go back to. And it might take a sec. This is a pretty big file. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I'm going to let you guys play with these files here that we're using today. I'll just set a link for that, and then you can download this shot, and then there's a couple more that you can download as well. Okay, so now I'll rename this base layer, or our main layer, main composite layer. We'll just rename it composite. And the only thing I really wanted to do this photo is add maybe a filter and then a local adjustment just to stylize. So I'm going to add a filter with effects, and I'm going to add one of my favorite filters on for water, which is the sunshine filter. And I love the way the sunshine is playing down here on the water, but I don't like what it's doing to the mountain up here. So I'm just going to hit M on my keyboard to grab my masking bug, and I'm just going to drop this down on the horizon line to remove it from the mountain. So now if I turn this off and on, it's only being applied to this water area here, and it makes the water look a little bit more natural in the reflection. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is I want to apply a little vignette using a local adjustment. So we're going to go into our local adjustment tab here, and with this new local adjustment layer, I'm going to set it to darken, and then I'm going to grab my local adjustment gradient up here, which you can also grab by holding down Shift and hitting K on your keyboard. And then I'm going to go into the shape area, and I'm going to choose a different shape for my mask, and I'm going to choose center. And now watch as I drop this down, it's created sort of a vignette for me. So now I can just modify it by dragging in on these handles here. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create sort of a line leading up to the mountain to kind of just entice the viewer to look up here. So an easy way to do that is just drag your vignette over and then align it with your leading lines. So you'll see that I have these leading lines in this rock here that are leading into the frame. Well, if I rotate this vignette or this local adjustment layer to kind of match that, and I go over and I'll increase the feathering quite a bit, and then we can go over to our adjustment and I turn this off and on. It does an awesome job of leading the viewer into the frame, but we need to modify it a little bit more. So let's go to our local adjustment layer, and in our masking options, I'm going to view this mask, and it's a little bit too strong on the feathering. So I'm going to go over to my feathering and my masking, and I'm going to turn that up 100%. So now if I view this, it's a little bit more feathered, and now I can just go to my opacity on my local adjustment layer, and I can just pull it back to however I want it to be. Cool. So now if I turn these reflection layers off and the sky layer, and I'll reset this base layer, now if I turn this off and on, in not a lot of time, we've swapped our sky out and set the base look for the shot by using a few creative masking techniques and then just a simple local adjustment layer. So night photos, using creative masks on night photos. I love using creative masks on night photos because it allows you to really target the specific areas that you're wanting to work with. So for this particular photo, I'm not going to do anything inside my tone and color at all, If I were to do anything, I'd probably just choose this camera profile neutral, but again, I'm just going to use this standard. It looks fine to me. So I'm going to head into effects, and the key to creating an awesome Astro photo is in your tone curves. So I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to head down and I'm going to choose curves. And the best way to bring out the stars in an Astro shot is to go into your tone curve here, and down here, kind of right above your blacks, with some dark shadows, just creep it in a little bit to your right, and you'll see it'll add in that nice contrast to your stars. Well, now what you got to do is you got to pull up on those midtones and highlights to bring out the light. So now we'll head up to our midtone point here, and now watch as I just pull it up. It's bringing out a lot of that star area in my shot. And I can pull it up even more with the highlight area. It kind of takes some tweaking at first, but once you get it, there we go, perfect. Okay, so I really like what that's doing to my stars here, but it's really creating a huge black area in my trees and my mountain here. So we need to modify it so it's only being applied to the stars here. So we're going to do that by creating a color range mask. So we're going to head into our curves pane here, or our curves filter, and inside our masking options, I'm going to go down to color range, and I'm going to select it to enable it, and then I'm going to use this color dropper here, and I'm just going to drop it on this area of black. Okay, so now let's go and we'll view our mask, and obviously it's being applied to all of the black areas on our photo. Well, we need to head down to our color range, and we'll just pull back on it maybe about 10 or so, just so we can target the specific areas that aren't on our trees and our mountain. So now that we have the white area targeted, let's head up and we'll invert this mask so that it's being applied there. And now we can even modify it a little bit more, probably about there. So now if we view this and we turn this off and on, it doesn't darken up this area down here like it did before, and now we can go back and modify this to bring in some of that shadow detail. So I'm going to name this stars curve so that we know that this first curve layer is for our stars. So now we need to deal with our mountain and our trees here. So we're going to go up and we're going to copy this mask. We're going to add a filter, and we're going to go into curves. And for this particular photo, we just want to pull up on the shadow area on this mountain and the trees. So let's head into our curves filter. We'll paste that mask, and now let's view this mask again. So now that we've applied that area of curves and that boost to our stars, we need to modify this area down here. So we'll invert this mask so that it's being applied to this area, and now we need to modify it so it's not so harsh. So we'll just pull up on the feathering to about right there. And now we can even modify the color range to get a little bit more away from the sky. Probably about, let's do about right there. So now if we view this, let's just pull up on our shadow point here on our tone curve. And you'll see it's only boosting up this area down here, and it's not pulling anything into the sky, which is what we want. So now we can modify this area down here without really modifying our sky to pull out all those dark details. So I'll just pull up on the shadows a little bit, and then I'll pull back, about right there. And we can even go in, and you'll see this little glow around our hill area here. We can go back and we can pull back on the feathering so that there's not such a harsh glow. Boom. Actually, I'm going to reset this real quick. Oops. I'll just reset this curves real quick, and I'm just going to pull up on the shadows again. Okay, perfect. So there we go. Okay. So now what we need to do is I want to go in and I want to pull out a little bit more brightness in the stars here. Well, a good filter for that is your sunshine filter. So let's add a filter, and I'll add sunshine. And what I want to do with the sunshine filter is I want to pull up on the amount all the way, and I'm going to use this strong preset. And you'll see that by doing that, it brings in a lot of nice contrast between our sky and our stars. So let's go over to our sunshine filter here, and I'm just going to pull back on the warmth to give it a little bit more cool look so it's not so yellow and orange. Like that. And we'll head up to 100 again. And so I'm going to go into my sunshine filter here, and in my masking options, I only want this sunshine filter applied to my stars. Well, because the stars are bright and the area around it is dark, we could use a luminosity mask. So let's go into our sunshine filter, and I'll choose luminosity mask. And then I can view my mask, and same thing like before, we can head down to our levels, and I'll remove some of the midtones, and then I'll pull back on the highlights, and I can just kind of channel this look for our stars. Cool. So now if I view this, and I turn this off and on, it gives it a nice little color boost in here. Oops. So if I zoom in, there we go, okay. And I turn this off and on, it gives it a nice boost right there. Okay, so now if I want the stars even brighter, just a quick way to boost them up is to go up to your layers pane, and I'm going to duplicate this main layer. And now I'm going to rename this duplicate layer white highlights. And I'm going to go into this masking options for this layer, and I'm going to do the same thing I did with sunshine, and I'm going to choose luminosity. And we're going to go and view our mask, and we're going to modify our levels to tone in and strictly access that one area where the stars are. Maybe right. Again, it just takes some fine tuning. Okay, so now if we view this, now that we have this layer selected, it's only being applied to that luminosity mask area. So what we can do is, because we can modify each layer's tone and color separately, I'm going to go into this develop tab here for our white highlights layer, and I'm just going to head down to our whites, and I'm going to pull them up all the way. Well, not all the, maybe not all the way, maybe about 78. And then I'm going to go up to my highlights, and I'll pull those up quite a bit as well. And you'll see that by turning that off and on, it's done an awesome job of pulling out all the highlights in this luminosity masked area, rather than just pulling it up on the entire layer and creating a big blob of exposure.